below represents the best possible life that you can imagine, and the bottom represents the worst possible life. Where do you fit on that ladder? It's called the Cantrell Ladder. Well-being has been validated extensively. It's for over 50 years in the U.S. And again, to demonstrate the difference between mental illness and well-being, if you're mentally ill, again, you likely could be diagnosed with clinical depression or some other disease. But well-being is quite different, and it might be typified this way. So if you left this conference and you went home and you found a note on the kitchen table from your significant other that said, "I've had it, I'm out of here. By the way, I drained our bank account and I took the dog, but the cat's at the vet, you can have the cat." You would score very, very low on well-being there, but you would not be mentally ill. You would still score well on Kessler-6, right? So you can have low well-being and be mentally healthy, or you can be, but if you do score high on Kessler-6, there's a good chance you score low on well-being as well. There is overlap, but it's small overlap, not large overlap. So we looked at a number of factors that might contribute to poor mental health or low well-being, and these are just some of them. I won't read through the list, but in our survey, we tested for the presence of these things, and one of the things that we had hypothesized early on was that the fact that veterinarians are often forced to do what would be called unnecessary euthanasias, where they have to kill a pet that they could fix. We thought that would be a significant contributor. It turned out not to be. While veterinarians do experience that with some frequency in practice, particularly companion animal practice, it isn't a major contributor to either low well-being or to mental illness. So let's talk about mental health first. Again, what we found was that serious psychological distress, or mental illness as measured by the Kessler-6, veterinarians were statistically the same as the general population in the U.S. About 5.3 for veterinarians, I think 4.7, and this is for employed adults. So we used that segment. There was the most widely used study for employed adults in the U.S. is a study called the Panel Study for Income Dynamics, and it's administered by the University of Michigan, and it's been used since 1965 and quoted in thousands of research studies. Now, Dr. Nett, in an opt-in survey that he and his colleagues did, found 9.3% of people that scored high on the Kessler-6. So again, that was an excellent study with almost 11,000 respondents. But again, it was an opt-in study, not a representative study. We found that about half of people who scored high in Kessler were receiving treatment, either medication or counseling or whatever. And there were some people who didn't score high in Kessler that were also receiving treatment. So about half were not, of those people who scored high in Kessler, were not receiving treatment. And we did see that a lot of that was due to the stigma issue, which you've heard about today. And by the way, I'm just really giving you the tip of the iceberg on this study. We have reams of data on this. The major self-reported conditions for those that scored high in Kessler were, again, these were self-diagnosed, were depression, compassion, fatigue, or burnout, or anxiety. We did see that that younger veterinarians were significantly at higher risk than older veterinarians. So the solid red bars here are veterinarians. The tinted red bars are their counterparts in the U.S. population. And what we see is that these are male veterinarians, female veterinarians, and their counterparts. So for those veterinarians that are younger than 45, they have much higher levels of mental illness than their counterparts. Among older veterinarians, we did not see a difference. Their level of mental distress, serious psychological distress, was about the same as that found in the general population. Certainly, we found that serious psychological distress increased with the number of hours worked. And also, it wasn't just hours, it was among those people who were working fewer hours or more hours than they desired to work. They had higher levels of serious psychological distress than those people who were working about the level of hours that they wanted to work. So here were people about the same amount of hours, and it was 2.7%, whereas more than desired or less than desired were 8.4 and 6.4 respectively. Also, we had an evaluation for how people rated how well they were doing financially, and as you might expect, those who said that they were not doing well financially scored higher in serious psychological distress than those who said they were doing well financially. We also, as you may know, student debt is a huge issue among U.S. veterinarians, particularly younger veterinarians, and we did find that, that interestingly, veterinarians who had student debt had higher levels of serious psychological distress than students who didn't have student debt, than veterinarians that didn't have student debt. But we didn't find much difference based on the amount of student debt. So someone who had, for example, more than $200 US of student debt didn't necessarily score higher on average on Kessler-6 than people that had less than $100,000 in student debt. The average in the U.S., by the way, is about $180,000 in student debt for new DVMs. We looked at factors that may contribute to either poor mental health or to better mental health, and things that contributed to reduced levels of serious psychological distress were out of about 15 or 18 things that we measured, these scored the highest. So spending time with family, socializing with friends, traveling for pleasure, reading for pleasure, and limiting time on social media. There was an adverse relationship between the amount of time spent on social media and mental health. So in other words, if you're spending more than 2 hours a day on Facebook or Instagram, whatever, don't. Now, interestingly, we speculated about why traveling for pleasure, reading for pleasure was correlated well with people that had better mental health. And our hypothesis is that those are things that take your mind off work. You know, if you're visiting the Eiffel Tower or Westminster Abbey or the Grand Canyon, you're doing things for recreation, or you're into reading novels, those things take your mind off of work, and you don't just stew in those things. So now we'll talk about well-being. So we found that among veterinarians that are under 45 and 65 or over, that there were really no statistical differences between men or women on well-being. There were some statistical differences between veterinarians aged 45 to 64, where male veterinarians had higher levels of well-being than female veterinarians. Hours worked dramatically impacted well-being. So well-being research tends to use three constructs, low, medium, and high. We called ours suffering, getting by, or flourishing. Again, well-being is measured on a 0 to 10 scale. If you're flourishing, you scored 8 to 10. If you're getting by, you scored 6 or 7. If you're suffering, it was 5 or less. This corresponds with the kind of breaks that Gallup and other people in PSID use. So for our total sample, we had 9.1% suffering and 58% flourishing. But again, as you went from less than 30 hours a week to more than 45 hours a week, those suffering increased, and these are all statistically significant differences, and well-being, those that were flourishing, dropped significantly. And again, on the number of hours worked, if it was more or less than desired, it significantly impacted well-being. So about the right amount, 72% fell into the flourishing category versus those that were working more hours or fewer hours. And one of the reasons we think that fewer hours plays in here is that the majority of employed veterinarians in the U.S. work on production, which in other words they get a percentage of the revenue that they produce. So if you're paid on production and your practice isn't that busy, that means you're making less money than you would if your practice was real busy. So if you're working fewer hours, chances are you're producing less revenue. We found that owners scored higher in well-being than associates. And so again, here's total. These are owners versus associates, and male owners versus female owners. Again, men scored higher in well-being, and then and associates. Student debt impacted well-being as it did in mental health, doing poor financially. Again, same thing, similar factors. Then we looked at work factors that were most associated with high well-being, higher income, as you can imagine, working fewer hours, lower levels of student debt, being an owner, and not working evenings. And a lot of these are interrelated because owners tend to have higher incomes. And if you're a veterinarian that is 50 years old or more, chances are you didn't graduate with much or any student debt. Whereas in today's environment, younger veterinarians have excessive student debt. Non-work factors associated with high well-being, again, were very similar to the mental health, traveling for pleasure, spending time with family, socializing with friends, having a good social network, having a hobby, exercising, being married or in a relationship. So, of course, our recommendation is if you're low in well-being, get married, right? And you're not, no, I'm just kidding. So, probably one of the most disturbing findings for the veterinary profession in the U.S. is we asked respondents whether they would recommend veterinary medicine to a friend or family member who is considering a career, and only 41% would recommend the profession. And we had some data on doctors, on human physicians, and there 51% would recommend their profession. We did not have any data on the general population, so we did a study. We joined an omnibus study of consumers, of adult employed, and there 70% of employed adults in the U.S. would recommend their profession to a friend or family member. And interestingly, for veterinarians, the younger you are, the less likely you would recommend the profession. Among non-veterinarians, the younger you are, the more likely you would be to recommend the profession you're in. The two major reasons why veterinarians don't recommend the profession, one has to do with income or finances, and the other has to do with work-life balance, basically. So our conclusions were that there are opportunities at the organizational, practice, and individual level to make change, that economics play a role, but it's not the only factor. And you can get a lot more information about this study if you go to www.vetwellbeing.com. There's a published article about the study, plus a lot of other data. We are repeating this study this year. The survey will drop next week. And we are benchmarking the key findings of the 2017 study, but also exploring a number of other issues that came up prominently. One is burnout. We're using a standardized tool to measure burnout, job satisfaction, substance abuse disorder, again, which came up fairly high, stress management, cyberbullying, which has become quite a topic in the U.S., and then household financials, so looking not just at veterinary income, but on household income and debt. So, and there are several other factors as well. And again, the source is veterinarywellbeing.com. So, yeah.